pretty interesting and made a.
John Jr.'s plane went down before they knew it had gone down, and the news person was talking about how great the weather was, how clear it was.
Yeah.
And the CNN commentator said, well, we can absolutely rule out weather as the cause. And of course, later that became the cause.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, he had some of that and how they could have located it right away with the equipment that they had and how they just weren't looking for it, basically.
Is Hanky going to be here this morning? Is Hanky going to be here this morning?
I don't know. I hope so, but thanks, Paul. Put the yellow one across the front
I recognize it.
You want to write a little note to Ted Sherrod?
No, not really.
Really? No.
That's all right.
I think I talked to him once and said, well, how do you and Lisa Please differ? And he goes, well, there are a number of
Hey, how long have you known Ted?
I don't know Ted. I've only met him a couple times. At
John,
these
how long
things.
you know Ted?
Me, since the 70s, I guess.
Now, you know that histrionic personality he has?
Yeah.
Was he like that in the 70s? Or?
Yes.
From what
No,
I
he's always
heard.
had that, like, he has that voice he goes into, you know, it's kind of like stentorious voice.
Well, no, not that, but the histrionic personality.
No, he's also always had a personality that's kind of.
I'll tell you this, he's one of the
Effusive.
reasons the LA journalists wouldn't cover this case, because they would meet him and they go, oh my God, forget it. You know, it's like, in a way, he personally shut down the investigation of the main
He's
street.
always like that. Was he
All right.
always real eccentric?
Well, good morning, folks. We'll try and get this on the road. We're going to go to noon. If people are here at the hotel, but their planes don't go till later, you can take your stuff out of your room and store it here. We've got this room till 5 o'clock, but the schedule's going until 12. But if we need to hang around, we'll have a little space. And we also have still available some copies. This is Into Evidence. It's an 8 DVD set from the Pittsburgh conference at the Cyril Wecht Institute on Forensic Science and Law in 2003. It's got a lot of key researchers there, all inspectors there, and they gave us a substantial discount rate for COPA rate of $149.95 instead of $250, and COPA actually gets a kickback. So if anybody wants, I've got copies here, or these brochures would allow you to order it directly from them, and then you can just write and tell them you're getting the COPA rate. But I do have some copies left if people want to get them today. We were talking in the last few days, and the schedule today is we're going to start off with Lisa Pease, and then Jamie Hecht has a poem that won an award about the Kennedy assassination he wanted to read, and then he and I might talk a little bit about 9/11. I want to talk about the intellectual authorship of 9/11. And some people have discovered, sort of behind the scenes, a quite interesting little nest of snakes, and then COPA events. But we were talking over the last few days about Deep Throat and whether Mark Flelch is really Deep Throat. And interestingly enough, there's an article on that subject by none other than Edward J. Epstein.
Oh, no. Of course, he loves it, that Phelps Deep Throat.
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting because he at least has the nuance to suggest that if Felt was one of the Deep Throats, he thinks it's a composite character and that some other people might have been involved. So he doesn't name any of them, of course, but
Doesn't name Robert Bennett.
yeah, that's right.
Jim Hogan's
No.
come out against this Phelps thing.
I think.
Who has?
Jim Hogan.
Oh, well, yeah, well, Hogan knew it was Bennett, and he tried to write a book with Leonard Garment from the Plumbers, and Garment pulled out of the evidence at the last
I think he made a
minute.
recent statement.
Good. Well, we need to
Is
say.
this Epstein story article, is this a brand new one? Like the
This-
last couple days?
This was an online reprint from what? Counterpunch. Counterpunch.
He's an Epstein, Jesus.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think that's bad? They had the Jon Stewart on the Daily Show the other night, and he does interviews, and he's interviewing Gerald Posner. But this is how surreal it was. It's Gerald Posner on his new book, Secrets of the Kingdom, where he's trying to blame Saudi Arabia for everything, and he's mentioning this informant that they have captured who names some Saudi royal princess and a Pakistani general as funding the terrorism. And then he starts talking about how the CIA took this information to Pakistan and Saudi, and within a short period of time, all four of the people are dead. And he starts talking about their unusual deaths, and one guy going to a hospital for the stomach, and he's dead, and another guy, single car accident on the way to the funeral, and then the third guy dies of, the official position is he dies of thirst on a drive in his car. And so it was like watching Gerald Posner play Penn Jones. So, I mean, you know, suddenly now he's a conspiracy theorist when it comes to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So,
Has Posner changed his position?
hmm?
Has Posner changed his position?
No, this is just he's blaming Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, but he's saying they would do these murders, you know,
But
and
it's
fake
not
deaths.
These murders took place, that these were conspiracies.
Yeah, he says that these 4 people, you know, the 3 Saudis and the Pakistani that are named as financiers of terrorism were murdered by the terrorists when their names came out, or by the states, either one. And all I'm just saying, he's now talking like a conspiracy theorist when it comes to Saudi Arabia, but the United States, that kind of doesn't happen here. You know, so no, he hasn't changed his position on the Kennedy stuff. He's just become a conspiracy theorist by default. And then another thing that's roiling around that you may know about is this Downing Street memo that shows that there was a pretty conscious attempt to manufacture the weapons of mass destruction and to influence the intelligence. And there is a coalition of a number of progressive groups that have pulled together, including 9/11 Citizens Watch now, to try to push for a congressional inquiry, and John Conyers is pushing for that. So it's picking up a little bit of steam. And another piece of recent news, scientists, if you haven't got enough bugs in your life, scientists create remote-controlled flies. Yale University researchers say that they've used lasers to create remote-controlled fruit flies, and it could lead to a better understanding of overeating and violence in humans. Not quite sure how, but that's science. But they say the study could ultimately help identify the cells associated with psychiatric disorders. Yeah, the ones that they lock you in, I think. Overeating and aggressiveness, you know, we're all just descendant from fruit flies. You thought it was monkeys.
Johnson made they could use that technology for assassinations.
Well, right. They could send a little fly to go up your nose and kill you. But they have tried to miniaturize like little, you know, fly on the wall, like listening devices or, yeah, like mini predators, you know. Can't kill you, but it can, you know, annoy you to death, right? That's it. So,
You try to kill the bug and overspray and kill yourself.
yes, that's it.
Remember the earwig in Twilight Zone?
Yeah, that's it. So, former FBI 9/11 whistleblower Colleen Rowley may run for Congress, and she's also being suggested for the Ethics Committee. And then one more story, just to give you an idea, sort of the, it's always the same wherever you look, but it says the U.S. government has for years kept in its sights on one of the world's most notorious arms traffickers, a guy named Victor Bout, known on both sides of the Atlantic as the Merchant of Death, implicated in running guns and missiles, combatants around the world from Taliban to the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, the UNITA rebels in Angola, and the teenage army of Liberia's former tyrant Charles Taylor. He's blacklisted on the U.S. Treasury from doing business in the United States, and Clinton says we're trying to take him out of business. But now the Bush administration has hired at least one company tied to his network with the war effort in Iraq, and it's something called Airbus, B-A-S, a company tied to Bout, flying charter missions under control of the U.S. military in Iraq. It's overseen by Victor Bout's brother, Sergei, and his longtime business manager, Richard Chichakli, an accountant who lives in Texas. In the past, payments for the Airbus have gone to a Kazakh company in the United Nations, identifies that company as a front for the leasing operations of Victor Bout's aircraft. So this is kind of like, you know, Air America and running the guns. Russ Feingold asked the Pentagon and the State Department to scour their files for evidence, you know, of this, and there were allegations that raised our concerns. We shared those with the Defense Department. Airbus, meanwhile, has continued to fly U.S. military missions into Baghdad, northern Iraqi air base of Balad, and Defense Energy Support Center as part of who they work for. They employ this unit that then employs Airbus, and for official government purposes, but they won't say what. They're prime contractors, and we don't have any control over who they subcontract to, they're saying. So they pay one, and then, you know, it's the cutout. And Chikali says that Airbus is a contractor for the U.S. Army, but I don't think I'll discuss that with you. And it was established in 2002 in Texas, quickly set up offices in the UAE, in the same building where Victor Bout had once operated an airline, Air Cess, an umbrella company for several Bout enterprises, and that became notorious during the 90s for its role in funneling weapons and cargo to militias in Angola. And then Sergei Bout, the brother, and Shikali helped run Air Cess, according to U.S. reports, and now they have Air Boss. So it's not too far removed, and you know, these sort of things come up, and then they're finding out that these private companies that were also fronting for CIA were running these planes for the renditions, where they were kidnapping people and putting them on private planes and then flying them to those countries where they could torture them. So, and then I don't know, also I got an email about this, that they have online, you can add this to your shopping cart online for either $489, you can just get the leather-bound numbered limited signed edition, or you can, for $889, you can get it with a solid walnut laser-engraved wooden box. It includes an oak tree and white picket fence artifact from the Dealey Plaza grassy knoll, and it's a memoir of Gerald Ford, the John F. Kennedy Assassination Report of the Warren Commission or something. So, introduction by Gerald Ford, and I have no idea what it is, but I mean, they're saying it's $1,000, and so, but you better hurry because they're going to take down the picket fence in Dealey Plaza. So maybe we should help them and cut it up into little pieces, and then we could fund research for the next 100 years. Oh, they're auctioning it. Well, you know, it's.
They're auctioning off.
I mean, they're auctioning off, yeah, a rebuilt fence. I mean, they've restored 100% of it, if not more, over the time. So, auctioning off the replica, you know.
It's like going to Berlin, all the
Right.
Berlin Wall. It's like, wow, they keep coming.
They keep coming, right. So, anyway, that's a little news introduction, and now we're pleased to have with us Lisa Pease, and she has been doing the research for many years into the various political assassinations. She and Jim DiEugenio did Probe magazine and the Citizens for Truth about the Kennedy assassination group out here in LA. That was an original founding group of COPA, and they also have this book, I'm sure you've seen it, The Assassinations, that's you know, been out recently, covering the whole range of political assassinations, and Lisa's talking today about her ongoing research into the Robert Kennedy shooting. Thanks.
Oh. Thank you. It's somewhere around 6 in the afternoon, according to my body at this point. I'm a little out of sync, so if I stumble and wander, please forgive me. I just got back from Europe. Hours earlier, 37 years ago today, of course, Robert Kennedy was shot just, you know, a few blocks from here. 37 years later, we are only a little bit closer to the truth. There's a lot that we know, and there's still a lot we don't know. There's a lot of avenues for investigation, and I'll point some of those up as we go through this. As I mentioned, I just got back from a 3-week European tour. I was part of a group talking about 9/11. I was there to speak about the environmental damage in New York City, and until I started looking at it, I can't tell you how horrific it is and how much the government knew about how toxic the air was, and yet they sent everybody back to Wall Street and said the air is safe to breathe. And when the EPA did try to issue some minor warnings, the White House stepped in and altered their statements. So I encourage any of you who care about this, especially if you have friends who are resistant to a big, wide-ranging conspiracy around 9/11, just point them at the health issues. That should get them angry enough to remove Bush from office. Boy, it sure made me angry. Anyway, our country is itself like a wounded body, misdiagnosed by physicians. Because until we find the true causes of our social malaise, we're going to be constantly fixing what ain't broken and breaking what doesn't need to be, you know, what shouldn't be touched. I want to open with a quote that most of you will probably recognize. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it an entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? That's from The Matrix, Morpheus, you know, when he was introducing Neo to the concept of taking the red pill to find out what's really going on. That movie, again, is a great conversation opener for friends who are resistant to conspiracy. Once once their mind is open, if they want to have their minds opened, you can start with some media misrepresentations, and God, there's plenty of current events to open their minds, the missing weapons of mass destruction, to get them to understand that we too live in the matrix. Our reality is informed by what we see on TV, what we hear on radio, what we get in email, and to some degree what we experience firsthand. Of all of these, I think we trust most the things we experience firsthand, and that's maybe not appropriate, because when you experience something firsthand, you're only seeing a slice of what's going on, and you're really not seeing the picture. So I know, a lot of times you meet somebody and they have this really cool story, and you go, wow, that must be true. I talked to them and he wasn't lying, I could tell. Well, I got to tell you, there's some really good liars out there. You got to be careful. I like to give people an analogy. If somebody shows you a picture of a man robbing a bank, you're going to say, wow, that's a criminal and these are the innocents. But if somebody then pulls the picture back and you see there's a second man holding a gun to the first man's head while he robs the bank, suddenly you realize that man is the real victim. So it is important for us to try to get the whole picture. I feel the Robert Kennedy case suffers from that a great deal. The picture is too cropped that we've been told, in most of the mainstream media, shall we say. So the goal here is to enlarge that picture, to show you what has been kept from you, so you can better understand what transpired. Of the assassinations of the 60s, only the RFK case seemed readily open and shut. A lot of people, even Mark Lane, said, well, there, is a true lone assassin. People just couldn't believe, that Sirhan standing there firing in front of 70 witnesses didn't actually kill Kennedy. A lot of people felt that they saw it happen on TV. I've had people say that. No, I saw Sirhan shoot him on TV. And it's misleading because there was coverage before the event, there's coverage immediately after the shooting, but there was no coverage during the shooting, or at least none we've ever seen. If there was, that has not been shown on TV. So people have a perception in their mind that they saw this all happen and they know what happened. And of course, it's entirely wrong. I have a personal experience with the power of images in this case. I got interested in the RFK assassination after seeing a cartoon. It's just a very simple little cartoon, two people standing, one Robert Kennedy, one Sirhan, and Sirhan was facing Kennedy, but Sirhan's arm went, woo, all the way around behind Kennedy to shoot him from behind the right ear. And I'm like, is that what we're supposed to believe? A man standing in front of him shot him from behind? How does that happen? So I had read books in the past, but when I was young, I read everything. I read anything about anything. So, I didn't know what to believe. But when I saw that picture, I thought, I have to go look at this again. And of course, the more I looked, the cartoon was true. That is what we're supposed to believe. And it's simply not possible. I'm sure Larry yesterday talked about, I'm not going over the basic facts of the case. I assume most of you have read something or know or probably heard something yesterday. I want to take you a little bit beyond where I left off in my article, some of the new stuff that I've come across, if that's all right. If anybody wants to go back and get the basics, see me afterwards or buy the book. There are plenty of books on that. But I do want to say this, that Robert Kennedy's assassination paved the way for Richard Nixon to ascend to the presidency, followed by former Warren Commission member Gerald Ford. And if either of two would-be assassins had succeeded in killing President Ford, Nelson Rockefeller would have held the highest office in the land. And who else benefited that we aren't even aware of? Who are the people behind the scenes who benefited from this? We should never take lightly events that affect the balance of power in the country. All right, when we see that, we know we need to investigate further. These things do not happen by accident. Power does not shift wildly. I think all of us here know that. Thank you. And of course, when the mainstream media collectively turned their backs on the investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy, it was as if they, and by proxy the public, had given permission to conspirators to conduct assassinations again without fear of prosecution. Any lawman will tell you that if you let people get away with a crime once, they will continue to commit that crime over and over. People always ask, why are you still looking into this? It's been almost 40 years. Who cares? And, there's no statute of limitations on murder, and there's certainly no statute of limitations on the truth. And if we want to live in a fictitious reality, then we get, unfortunately, the byproducts of that. I kind of want to know what happened so I can make better choices. We have a recent example of the devastation that misrepresentations and omissions of information can cause. The ongoing collaboration between the national security forces and the media allowed the public to be ensnared in the story, now proven false, that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. That story, repeated ad nauseum to the American people, led to the deaths of thousands of American soldiers and many more thousands of innocent Iraqis. If people understood the ongoing interplay between the government and the media, they might have been more skeptical of such claims from the start when it really mattered. It's a little late now. Perhaps the most exasperating aspect of this case is how much good work got buried. The Los Angeles Police Department did an incredibly thorough job on this case. It's easy to blame them and say, but you got to look at the files. They pursued, even remote angles of conspiracy. They were really looking. All right, but of course what the good guys in the LAPD didn't know is that a few in their midst were busy subverting the investigation. All roads in the investigation came through two people who had sole authority to rule on the credibility of witnesses and which further avenues of investigation to take, and I'll come back to them in a second. Witnesses who gave information that supported the conspiracy angle were intimidated into changing their stories, and it's right there on the record, and it's no different than in any of these cases. Somebody comes out and speaks the truth, bad things start to happen to them. Some of their records have record check scrawled across them, meaning if their testimony ever gets out, we better have a way to discredit them. And that kind of stuff is an obvious red flag. Clearly, somebody is very concerned not about finding out what happened, but about keeping what happened from the public. It's right there in the papers. If you take up this journey, you will be amazed and likely outraged at what has been kept from you, not just by the police, but by the media, who are, wittingly or unwittingly, co-conspirators to many important crimes of state. And this is perhaps the most tragic legacy of all. That these assassinations happened is horrible, but the complicity of the media in helping to keep the lid on these cases is even more tragic. The country can sustain the loss of a few exceptionally great men, but it cannot sustain the loss of truth. We cannot survive as a society if we are held prisoners in a false reality. But there's cause for hope. You are here, you are listening, you feel it like a splinter in your mind. You know there is something more, and you are right. So let patience be your ally, take the red pill, and we'll see how far it goes. I wanted to mention it's appropriate that Watergate is in the news again, because to me the key to all these crimes is in the cover-up. All right, you can look forever to find the literal assassins and some of the minor details, but if you look at who covered it up, that's the direct line to who is responsible. People don't engage in lying and deceit for somebody else's behalf. People lie to protect their own butts. I think we all know that, and that's why, when you look at any of the conspiracy theories about any of these cases, it is important to think about the bigger picture. For example, if LBJ had used his own private, non-governmental network to kill Kennedy, there would have been no one left to produce that awful Peter Jennings special on the 40th anniversary. So that kind of stuff is the clue that there are bigger forces that are still in power, who feel the need to continue to cover this up. If Robert Kennedy had been killed by, a local cop, it would have come out. If he had been killed by a few, local mobsters, it would have come out. The fact that the media will not touch this case, to me, shows how very sensitive this case is. James Angleton, the former director of counterintelligence at CIA, once talked about the need to muddy the waters, to obscure the trail, to make it hard for people to find the truth. And until recently, the RFK case has been somewhat pristine and unmuddied, and that's probably because so few people are interested in it, so few people have been paying attention. But I don't know, about other sites on the internet, but our Sitka site, rather, the most hits of any articles are always the RFK pieces. That's the one people seem to find and have the most interest in, which I think is fascinating. And I think, possibly we are reaching critical mass where enough people are starting to think there's something else going on there, that now alternate theories and alternate patsies are appearing to muddy the waters and make the truth harder to find. And of course, people make money off of disinformation too. They don't all have to be spooks. Some people just like to capitalize, on that kind of stuff. There's a market, and if we aren't discerning when we buy books to add to our collection, if we just buy every book that comes out, we're just fueling that. So I do kind of take a little time. If there's a book you're mildly interested in, go look at the library. Don't give them the money, if you suspect. I'm not one to say go buy everything. It just legitimizes the disinformation and the profiteers. And of course, not all information is equal, and not all information is even information. How many of you have read the book Nemesis? Any of you? Have you seen it? Yeah, a couple of you looked through it. How many of you have seen my response about Nemesis? One or two. Okay. This is a new book that has come out in the last year, actually a couple years, I think. It's a book, it came out 2 years ago, and then it got replayed by an article a year later. So, somebody is trying to keep this story in front of us. And it basically says that Onassis killed Robert Kennedy. Now, I saw this line of attack coming a few years earlier. I got a call one day from a lawyer in Indiana who tried to sell me on the Onassis did it line. And he had, this long and involved story about how he'd met Thane Eugene Caesar's wife and represented her on a traffic charge, and that Thane Eugene Caesar had basically confessed to him that he had killed Robert Kennedy. Yeah, right there, I knew that. There's no way in hell that would be true. But that, he then added, of course, that he did it on behalf of Onassis. And at that, I just burst out laughing on the phone. And the guy got really angry. And he started threatening me. And he said, the mob is going to get you. And I'm like, oh, okay, if I don't believe Onassis did it, the mob is going to get me. No, I actually didn't even write it down, I mean, to me, it was so ludicrous. But I did, after that call, I called a few of my friends and I said, oh my God, guess what the newest line of disinformation is going to be? Somebody's now trying to put out the word that Onassis killed Kennedy. All right, and what's really interesting about that is that there was a CIA man who was hired to discredit Onassis in '54, and it was written about in the IG report on the Castro assassination plots. And that man is Robert Mayhew. Mayhew's job was to sink Onassis. Onassis essentially had the shipping contracts for all the Persian Gulf oil at one time. And that was bad for two reasons, because let's face it, the CIA exists to protect private business interests. It doesn't exist to protect public anything. And the people in this country wanted access to that. It's a lot of money. And of course, where the oil goes, that's also where the power and the intelligence information goes. So they wanted in on two levels. So the CIA tapped Robert Mayhew, who had been a former FBI man, had set up his own shop, and said, we need you to bring this guy down. And he did it through a mixture of discreditation and pressure and bribery. And he found out who had given him the contract and pressured that guy into breaking the contract. So I find it really interesting that Robert Mayhew was a key source for the Onassis Did It book. That makes sense. All right. Now, when people put down conspiracies, they do so on the basis of silly ones like, Onassis did it, or Elvis did it, or, stuff like that. But a real, scientifically valid theory does have some predictive value. And to me, that's always a test of any conspiracy theory. If it can explain, events that are to come, or if it has some predictive value, then it probably, there's probably some truth to it. So, of course, I have a theory. My theory is that the CIA killed both Kennedys. All right, and if my theory has any validity, it will help predict certain things, such as when false patsies come forward, the CIA will be behind it. So, at least on the surface of it, if you look at the book, Nemesis, you will find it's not just Mayhew. He's also got Miles Copeland and several other CIA people who are behind that book. It's really hard not to see the CIA's hand in that particular story. And of course, Mayhew is involved in the Robert Kennedy story in a variety of ways that I have just barely touched on. I'm going to try and expand on that a little bit more because I think it's kind of fascinating. And he's still alive. And I know somebody who knows him. I'm trying very hard to get a meeting with him. I'm sure he will lie to me, but the lies will be interesting. And you never know, what might slip out. All right, so as far as Mayhew and the Robert Kennedy story, as I mentioned, of course, he was hired by the CIA to plan Castro assassination plots. The CIA wouldn't have hired him if they didn't think he had some expertise in that area. All right, Mayhew in turn turned around and tapped his longtime friend and associate, Johnny Roselli, to help him with the Castro plots. Roselli then recruited others into the plot and took the reins of several ultimately unsuccessful plots. And as I'm sure Larry probably told you yesterday, Johnny Roselli appears to be involved in compromising Grant Cooper, Sirhan's lead attorney, before Cooper actually took on the Sirhan case. Cooper was caught with a grand jury transcript, which was ostensibly put there by Roselli. And this is very damning, and was Roselli working out of his own interest, or was he working for Mayhew again? That's a very interesting question. Don't know the answer, and I don't know how to prove the answer, but I suspect, based on other things as well. I have no evidence that Cooper made a deal. All right, no direct evidence. I have circumstantial evidence, though. When the police came to Cooper and the judge in chambers, on the record, and said, we can't prove these bullets say where we come from. You're just going to have to stipulate to that. Cooper just waves his hand. Yes, sure, I'll say whatever you want me to say. Now, the police would not do that to a lawyer. Lawyers live for, this kind of evidence, reasonable doubt. They can't prove the bullets came from, therefore, he should have been able to get his client off on that alone. And so the fact, not only that he, said that, but that the police knew they could bring this up in front of him, means to me not only was Cooper compromised, but the police knew he was compromised. And the judge was likely compromised too, because if the judge was not, why would he let this transpire? An honest judge would say, whoa, wait a minute. You're not defending your client. Something is really screwy here. So this was a mock trial, a setup, from the very beginning. I think that one piece of evidence is enough to make that case. All right, let me see. I wanted to talk about Mayhew in regards to a comment made by a man I know named John Meyer. Now, how many of you saw The Aviator? Anybody? 1, 2. There's a film about Howard Hughes, very interesting man, and the film only deals with the first part of his life before he gets in bed with the CIA. I think the more interesting part of the story is what happens when the movie ends from that point forward. But in the movie, there's a Johnny Meyer. That is not the John Meyer I'm about to talk about. John Meyer was actually one of the few liberals in Howard Hughes's camp. He was an anti-nuclear activist, if you will, at a time before people hardly knew what that was. But Hughes liked that because he was paranoid about everything, and he was worried that the atomic tests in Nevada would somehow pollute him. Right. Well, he was worried about his health. He was worried that he would be radiated. So he wanted, this guy to go sink the nuclear tests and get that to stop, and he almost actually got them to stop. It came very close. But ultimately did not succeed. But anyway, I met Meyer after we did a Watergate issue of Probe early on, and everything was related to the film Nixon that had come out. And after I'd written that, one of the articles in there dealt with Lyndall Schoenfeld, the FBI guy who had looked at the backyard photos and said, based on the pattern of dirt, I could tell it came from this camera and only this camera. Well, Schoenfeld had been involved in setting John Meyer up on a murder charge using the same sort of argument. There were like Xerox copies of Hughes documents, and he could prove they came from a certain copier, because of the pattern of dirt on it. When you blow anything up, you can make a pattern out of anything and do these huge blow-ups. So anyway, he loved it that I went after Schoenfeld, and he invited me up to his home in Canada, and I was on my way up there, and when I got there, he goes, Lisa, I had the strangest call. This is a guy I haven't talked to in 10 years. He said, while you were driving up here, I got a call from Robert Mayhew. And he said, how are you doing, John? Is there anything you need? Are we taking care of you? And John Meyer couldn't figure it out. And of course, I knew based on my research and my writing, I think Mayhew was maybe a little worried about what Meyer might tell me. And of course, he had good reason to worry, because one of the things Meyer did tell me is that he had occasion to talk to J. Edgar Hoover not long after the assassination because of his close association with Hughes. And Meyer said that Hoover said, we know the RFK hit was a Mayhew operation, but I'm powerless against the CIA. Now, when John Meyer told me that, I had not yet really started looking into the Robert Kennedy assassination, so I don't feel he was trying to mislead me based on my writing. I'd never even touched that case before. And so that stuck in the back of my mind, and I didn't know whether I was going to give that any credence. I hear a lot of things. Everybody tells me this guy did it, or that guy, or this guy said something. But years later, as I started looking into this, all of that started to hold true. There's even more Mayhew connections, which again I'll get back to this case. And if you've read my Angleton piece in the Assassinations, the book, you will see that James Angleton had a blackmail photo of Hoover and Tolson together having sex that he would bring out whenever he needed the FBI to comply with something. And it's even a little worse than that, because in the, what would it have been, the 40s, I guess, after World War II, the OSS had been disbanded, been broken into 2 pieces, essentially. And there were people who wanted, an ongoing intelligence service, but one of the people who really didn't want that was J. Edgar Hoover. He adamantly opposed it, as did many people in the Congress and Senate, and thought, it was like setting up an SS, a Nazi regime. They didn't want to see that happen. So what did the pre-CIA people, I will call them, since they weren't CIA yet, do? They arranged their own operation, and they basically went around and they got information on all kinds of people in Congress and Senate to show how another intelligence service could blackmail them, In other words, they were blackmailing them, right? And to prove that they were blackmailable. And one of the people who was, their biggest critic, of course, was Hoover. So that photo came into existence at that time. To me, it seems obvious it was part of that overall plot. This was written about by Miles Copeland, and he kind of writes about it in a guarded way, but reading between the lines, he's basically saying the CIA blackmailed itself into existence. Very, very interesting.
Hoover
Yeah. Pardon?
Hoover blackmailed Congress to make the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure that's where they got the idea. It works. Unfortunately, blackmail is a very successful tool. So, in terms of the RFK hit being a CIA operation, of course, that's a little harder to prove, but I think there's a lot of good evidence in that regard, and I'm sure if we look, we'll find even more than I've found so far. Let's start with the cover-up. No group is more responsible than the LAPD since they did the primary investigation, and like I said, it's unfair to blame them as a group because a lot of the officers did really good, deep research work. All right, but I mentioned before there were two individuals who kept shutting the lines of information down. There was a org chart. I keep wanting to bring that into one of these days. I'll publish it in a book because it shows the flow of information through Special Unit Senator. And at one point it gets to Manny Pena, Lieutenant Manny Pena, and that's the choke point. Everything at that point is up to him. He decides what gets pursued and what gets dropped at that point. So if you want to control the investigation, all you really have to control is Manny Pena. But in addition, the CIA also had Hank Hernandez, who ran the lie detector tests. And anybody who's talked to somebody who runs a lie detector or who has read about it will know that, a lie detector test, first of all, is not all that useful. There are many ways to, ruin the machine. If you're under a lot of stress, it may look like you're lying when you're not. And if you do a couple mental tricks, like doing a difficult math equation right before you answer, you can trick, it into showing signals as if you are, Anyway, there's ways to game the system from the person's point of view, but there's ways to game the system from the operator's point of view as well. And so if Hank Hernandez wanted to make somebody look like they're lying, he would just up the sensitivity level. If you want to make somebody look like you're, telling the truth, you just down the sensitivity level so things come out flat. So there's all kinds of ways that could happen. And provably, when you look at the testimony of certain people that he said were liars or were truth tellers, it's very easy to show that some people were made to be lying about things that were obviously true, or made to be saying they were telling the truth about things they had to be lying about, because there was other evidence that showed that. All right, but on a broader level, the CIA had been working with police and specifically the LAPD for some time. In the 50s, the CIA did a concerted effort to infiltrate, if you will, the various police departments in major cities. Partly it was an intelligence operation, and partly, who knows, what the other motives were. In the 1950s, the CIA went after Sukarno, the leader of Indonesia, and with the help of the LAPD in an operation run by Robert Mayhew, they made a film, a porno film. They hired an actor who looked like Sukarno and a blonde actress to play a Soviet bimbo agent who was supposedly, controlling him through sex, because he was known to have quite a sexual appetite. But again, that was a Mayhew-LAPD direct collaboration. In the case of the girl in the polka dot dress, the Sandy Serrano story, that was one of the ones where, because it was public, they felt the need to go after her and discredit her and shut that story down. There were several other witnesses, not only to the polka dot dress girl in general, but specifically to Serrano's exchange with the girl. There are like 3 others that I found, and I haven't even read all the witness statements. I still think I'll find a few more. There were several people who saw a Mexican girl on the stairs and the girl in the polka dot dress run by and have this exchange. We shot him, who did you shoot? We shot Kennedy. So they didn't feel any need to discredit the other witnesses because they were never made public, but they did go after Sandy Serrano in a big way. If you've never heard the tape of Hank Hernandez's lie detector session or whatever, with Sandy, where he's literally berating her and saying, if you love the Kennedys, you would not say such a thing. You dishonor them. And of course she loved the Kennedys. She was working on Robert Kennedy's campaign. And so she was just, an emotional wreck after this. And she ended up leaving the country for some years because of the pressure that had been brought to bear on her. It's hard. If you're a witness to a crime, God help you all. We may not know it for years later, but please, have the guts to hold by your story. She did for a very long time, and then she finally gave up, and I don't blame her. I think most of us might have done the same thing under that kind of pressure. Anyway. That's one of the most well-known examples, and of course, like I said, there are many other examples where the police went after people, got them to change their story. There was another girl who saw the girl in the polka dot dress earlier with Sirhan, so they went to her parents and said, if she's lying, we can arrest you. It's bad to give, false information to the police. And so, next thing we know, she's like, oh, they didn't say we shot Kennedy, they said they shot Kennedy. So people are, for the most part, caving in very rapidly. There was an interesting little thing they called let's see if I can get this right, the something caper incident. I can't remember the name. I want to say the Golden Gator caper or something. It was some little bar in Alhambra where supposedly Sirhan had been seen with what appeared to be maybe a mob hitman guy. And they had been having, dinner and talking. And two of the witnesses to this conversation were actually cops from the Alhambra area. But the LA police were able to convince even them that no, couldn't have been Sirhan, had to be this other guy. There's no way Sirhan would have been involved with those groups. But curiously, on the night of the assassination, there's like 3 reports of people seeing Sirhan and a girl and these 2 other guys in a car in Alhambra, acting weird, making comments, talking about the ambassador. So there does seem to be some little Alhambra, connection there. I'd like to know more about that. And time is always at a premium. It's difficult to get to the library during the hours it's actually open. As far as Lieutenant Pena, he had retired from the LAPD the previous fall, which is, again, very interesting. And he had retired and gone off to work with AID, a well-known CIA friend organization, the Agency for International Development. He shows back up in the hall shortly before the RFK assassination, and a reporter sees him and says, by then he had a new mustache. He said, "I didn't recognize you in that disguise." Oh, boy. And Pena is the one who shut down a lot of the interesting leads on the polka dot dress girl cover sheets. When there were interviews where they mentioned it, he would scroll. It's very distinctive handwriting. You can spot his a mile away. He uses a big, thick black pen, and no further interview, polka dot dress story, phony. I see that over and over. And then you read the story, and there's nothing phony about it. And they're all very corroborative, very similar. They're all telling the same story, And I talked about Sergeant Hernandez. He also worked for AID. And in addition, Manny Pena's brother said on a televised interview that his brother Manny was very proud of his service to the CIA. I mean, this is not a secret. So anyway, we'll return to my theory for a moment. So far, so good. If the CIA was involved in the assassination, they would necessarily be involved in the cover-up, with Manny at the checkpoint and Hank Hernandez on lie detector. They had really good control over the investigation. All right, and then if we look at Sirhan's defense team with Grant Cooper in control, who was himself compromised, possibly by Robert Mayhew, CIA, very likely that that team was in control as well. And of course, regarding the CIA and Sirhan, again, I assume that Larry Teeter talked about the evidence of hypnosis, of possible mind control, of the CIA's mind control programs, Operation Artichoke, and certainly MK Ultra. So I won't go into that at this time. But I do think, I personally do believe he was hypnotized. And I believe he was a hypnotized patsy. I truly believe from the evidence that he did not fire any shots, that he was firing blanks. The witnesses describe a shower of paper, oily residue. Several people who knew guns said it sounded like a cap gun, including Rayford Johnson, who's heard a lot of cap guns in his life, including Norbert Schley, the former Attorney General for California, who had been in the Army, who knew the difference between different kinds of guns. So credible people, were saying this was a cap gun or a blank gun, which would make sense. If you had somebody who was hypnotized, what if they, got a little weird on you? What if somebody said something that brought them out of the trance? You wouldn't want your hypnotized guy shooting the actual assassin before he got the job done. It would make much more sense to trust, a true hired gun. And we're about to come to who I think that was, of course, because this is another avenue that leads to Robert Mayhew. During the night, the hotel was guarded by the private firm Ace Security. Each of the guards from Ace was positioned somewhere in the hotel, keeping people out of certain areas, but 2 of the areas were unprotected. The southwest door of the embassy ballroom, where Sandy Serrano came and went through, and where the conspirators had fled to, was not one of the heavily protected doors. Most of the other doors were. If people went to the other entrances, they were not allowed in. And I don't know who guarded that door. But the other area, where people were not supposed to be, but anybody seemed to be able to get in, was, of course, the kitchen pantry. And one of the press people had come in, one of the RFK campaign staffers who was responsible for the press room. I wish I could draw this for you. If this is the embassy ballroom here, all right, and then this would be the pantry. It's kind of a connecting point, and then over here is the colonial room where the press were. So Kennedy had only 2 avenues to get to the press room. He either had to exit through the ballroom, which would be very insecure because, God, anybody could have gotten to him there, and then go into the press room that way, or he could hop through the pantry, which was much smaller and supposedly guarded, to get to the press room. The girl with the polka dot dress was very insistent during the night on getting a press badge because that would have allowed her to hang out in the pantry. She did ultimately get a press badge. People saw her, with the press credentials. Now, Sirhan, on the other hand, was a little scruffy that night. Everybody talked about him being baracho or, looking a little out of place. He wasn't dressed well. He wasn't in a party mood. He just looked dirty, grungy. He would not have been able to get a press pass. So it was very important for the conspirators that the kitchen pantry provide access to Sirhan. Otherwise, the plot goes nowhere, right? So who was guarding the pantry? One guess.
Peace security.
Well, who? Thane Caesar, of course. And that would make sense, wouldn't it? So anyway, he was the one guarding the room. He kept him out. And a former CIA man, Jim Rose, who had worked with Bill Turner, did he come yesterday? Yeah.
How did
He didn't make it down.
get the job?
That I don't know, and that's one of those avenues for investigation. I think that'd be important to know. And also, Thane Eugene Caesar had only joined up with Ace 2 or 3 days, before this, right at the end of May, just a few days before June 4th. But anyway, Jim Rose was the alias of a CIA man, a former CIA man, who worked on the Jim Garrison investigation directly with Bill Turner. They became friends. I got to know Jim Rose a little bit over time. He had left the CIA after their operations in the Congo. He had kind of been accidentally recruited into the CIA. He had been working in Korea, he was a soldier in Korea, and had stumbled into a camp where everybody was talking about the fact that the CIA was sending nerve gas balloons into North Korea, which was a state secret at that time and probably still to this day because no one's ever talked about that. But after that, they're like, well, we either have to kill you or make you join up with us. And they went to town and they, back to where he lived, and they interviewed all his people and decided he was a real anti-communist, so he would fit right in. And he was a nice, gung-ho, very patriotic, love America kind of guy. But when he was sent to the Congo and was working there, he goes, well, when they bombed, the Soviet tanks, I didn't have a problem with that. And he said, when they bombed the roads that the Soviet tanks were traveling on, I didn't have a problem with that. He goes, but when they bombed the villagers who were feeding the Soviets when they stopped there with their tanks, I had a problem with that. And so he kind of went on the run and went underground, and that's why he, wanted to help in the investigation. But anyway, he worked with Bill Turner on the RFK investigation as well. Bill Turner used him when he was working on his book. And one of the things he found, he told me, and I have not been able to corroborate this elsewhere, so I don't know that this is true, but it's one of those avenues for further investigation. He said he discovered that Thane Caesar had worked for Robert Mayhew when Robert Mayhew had his own private security firm here in LA just before he went to join the Hughes organization. And if that's true, that's very damning. That's very, very, very interesting. Because Mayhew's firm was not a very big firm. It's not like he employed hundreds of people. If Thane Caesar worked for him, they knew each other personally. So I would love to know more about that. And I found it really interesting in Moldea's book. He actually had a line in there where he said, and it's totally wrong, Thane Eugene Caesar never had any association with Howard Hughes. And yet in the same breath, he's like, of course he did work for Hughes Aircraft. And if anybody knows anything about Howard Hughes, Hughes Aircraft is like his pet baby. That's the part he actually really liked and was heavily involved in. There's a book called The Assassination Chain that, of all people, Jack Anderson wrote an introduction to. And in there, Sybil Leek says that she was introduced. She knew this guy who was like a covert operator, and she was at a bar in Las Vegas, and she noticed these two guys were always kind of hanging out and talking to her. And her covert friend said, one of those is a hitman, and that other guy is Howard Hughes' bodyguard, and his name is Thane Caesar. So if he was Howard Hughes' bodyguard at that point, he was definitely, again, in contact with Mayhew. It's just inconceivable they would not know each other at that point. All right, so there's a very interesting nexus. And what a lot of people probably don't know is that the Howard Hughes organization, again, where the film leaves off in The Aviator, he's had this big battle over TWA going up against the federal government. Well, the battles didn't end there. They just kept going. And so Howard Hughes actually went to the CIA and said, please, come, infiltrate my group, take it over, just help me keep my airline. He's like, I'll do whatever you want. I will help you, but you have to help me. And so that's exactly what happened. The CIA came in and infiltrated the Hughes organization very completely, and some will say actually completely took it over. In fact, the clue to that is that toward the end of Hughes' life, the holding company for all the Hughes organizations was actually called the Summa Corp. Now, if you know anything about Hughes, it was Hughes Aircraft, it was Howard Hughes Medical Center, it was Hughes Tool Company, it was Hughes this, Hughes this, Hughes this. He was a very egotistical man. He would not have named a company Summa. He would have named it the Hughes Summa Corporation. So just the fact that his name is not in it is kind of a sign, I believe, that the CIA was very near success. There are other interesting rumors about Hughes I will not mention at this point, but I encourage you to read the literature. There's some juicy little nuggets there. But in fact, John Meyer, when he was working for Hughes, almost everybody around him was CIA, and they all assumed he was too. So they would tell him things and let him in on stuff, thinking he was one of them. And he eventually took all the data that he discovered, including a CIA payoff list of people, the politicians that they were giving money to, and he took it to some writers at Playboy, who started a very interesting two-part article. It's called The Puppet Masters, about the CIA running the Hughes Corporation. And in there, they had a slip showing who the CIA was paying money to, and one of those people was Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, which is pretty darn interesting. Also, at the end of Part 1, they talk about what they're going to say in Part 2, and how it's going to have even more revelations and be very damning. Part 2 is all watered down, very weak, nothing there. And I finally found the author of those articles, and I said, God, that Part 1 was so good. That was so, oh, thank you so much for reading that. I'm like, what happened with Part 2? Silence. He would not tell me. He didn't want to go there, but clearly somebody got to them between Part 1 and Part 2. Anyway, so we have Mayhew involved in a variety of ways, possibly Mayhew, Roselli, Cooper, possibly Mayhew, LAPD, Mayhew, Eugene Caesar. It's hard not to see the hand of Mayhew. And then we have Mayhew behind the disinformation that's coming out saying it wasn't the CIA, it was Onassis. So it gets very interesting. Again, all this is circumstantial, doesn't prove anything. I can't accuse him of murder, I can't haul him into court, but I want to know more. I really want to know. And boy, if I could link, Manny Pena or something to Robert Mayhew, now that would be substantial. That would be really interesting. All right, so if my theory is right, again, that the CIA killed them, why would the CIA want to kill Bobby? I think it's more obvious why they'd want to kill John Kennedy, who was about to shut down the CIA. That's a pretty strong motive. What was Bobby's threat to the agency? I believe that it was partly that Bobby was on the trail of the CIA's role in his brother's death. And I believe that based on several things, which I'll read for you here. Within the first hour after his brother's death, one of the first calls he made was to a surprise duty officer at the CIA, and he called and asked, "Did your outfit have anything to do with this horror?" And of course, at that point, John McCone, wants to talk to him and actually drives out to his house in Hickory Hill, which was not far from Langley, and talked to him. And Walter Sheridan records the conversation as having gone like this, that Robert had said, "I asked McCone if they had killed my brother, and I asked him in a way that he couldn't lie to me, and they said he hadn't, that they hadn't. I asked some other CIA guy I knew, well, what does he mean when he said, I asked him in a way that he couldn't lie to me? He said he used religion, because they were both Catholic." Well, yeah, how Catholic is a CIA director going to be? I'm sorry. I find it really hard to believe, that he would hold God, in a higher place than his job and still have that job. Author Norman Mailer makes fun of this response in his novel about James Angleton called Harlot's Ghost. He has a fictional Angleton character laughing at this exchange and responding, of course I'm paraphrasing, "If he'd asked me, I would have told him if the job was done correctly, I'd be unable to give an accurate answer." Which would have been the better answer. And then Robert also called Haynes Johnson, a journalist who is close to the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and said, "One of your guys did it." Kennedy later asserted that same thing to Lyndon Johnson. And years later, that's a different Johnson, Haynes Johnson, I'm sorry. And then years later, Lyndon Johnson also expressed the opinion that the CIA was behind it. He told that to his aide, Marvin Watson. Robert Kennedy rarely talked about his brother's death outside of immediate family circles. The subject was taboo, and with good reason. If he was right in his earliest suspicions, evidenced by his actions in the first hour after his brother was shot, he knew he could only endanger his own life and perhaps the lives of his family if he started theorizing on what happened. But he did tell a friend during his campaign, "There were guns between me and the White House." So to the public, Kennedy showed one face. When a group of students at San Fernando Valley State College, not far from here, on March 25th, 1968, Robert said, "Nobody is more interested than I in knowing who is responsible for the death of President Kennedy," but he added, "I would not reopen the Warren Commission report. I've seen everything that's in there, and I stand by the Warren Commission." Now, privately, of course, he was more candid. He told Arthur Schlesinger one night that the Warren Commission had done a poor job, and he wondered how long he could avoid having to endorse it or criticize it, and he was really unwilling to reopen the whole tragic business. He started his own kind of covert investigation. He had different groups of his friends looking at different angles. He himself went down to Mexico City, and the CIA was very concerned about what he might discover there. In fact, the CIA had Robert Kennedy under surveillance, and they said in their own documents they considered it more important even than spying on the Soviet Union. What's that about? That's public information. That's not private. Robert asked Daniel Moynihan, a longtime family friend and then Assistant Secretary of Labor, to see if there's any evidence that Jimmy Hoffa, of course, had been involved. And Moynihan also investigated the Secret Service, but he found no evidence of Teamster or Secret Service complicity. But Kennedy kept looking. In '67, he sent Ed Guthman, to New Orleans to meet with Jim Garrison, who had arrested Clay Shaw for the assassination of President Kennedy as part of a conspiracy. He also asked his press secretary and friend Frank Mankiewicz if he thought Garrison, quote, had anything. And Mankiewicz replied, no, but I think there is something. And Robert said, so do I. You stay on it. Was Robert getting close to finding out what happened? Did his investigation of his brother's death in some way presage his own? Perhaps. While Mankiewicz pushed in one direction, Robert's longtime family friend and Get Hoffa Squad member Walter Sheridan pushed in another. Walter Sheridan is satisfied that Garrison is a fraud, Robert told Arthur Schlesinger. Sheridan had been an FBI man who'd risen to power and become NSA's counterintelligence chief at a time when no one even knew about the NSA. At least the CIA's name was public. The NSA's name was a state secret. You couldn't even say the name in public without being arrested. So it's interesting that Sheridan had this deep intelligence background. According to an article in an obscure Capitol Hill publication called The Government Employees Exchange, Walter Sheridan, quote, disposed over the personnel and currency of whole units of the Central Intelligence Agency. One wonders what Robert knew or didn't know about Sheridan's associations. And of course, this is not surprising considering that the NSA interfaced directly with CIA through Staff D. Staff D is where the MKUltra operations were buried and where the Castro assassination plots and other coup attempts were buried. The Sukarno attempts were buried in Staff D as well. All right, so Staff D, NSA, it's like that's your assassination link. So you have Sheridan, working at the other end, so to speak, of Staff D for the NSA. Sheridan had gone to New Orleans in the spring of '67 to do a white paper special on Jim Garrison. And once he was there, he paid Gordon Novell, a very colorful character who I've since had opportunity to meet and hang out with. That guy lies as easily as he breathes, I tell you, but he's a character. He paid Novell a big chunk of money. And by the way, Novell told me something interesting, which has not been seen anywhere in print, and I do believe it because I don't think he meant to tell me this. Every now and then somebody will just slip out. He's getting old. He's not as censored as he used to be. Because I asked him, who did the tapes that you made? He was hired by Garrison to do security. And so instead of doing anti-surveillance, he did surveillance. And he basically taped everything that happened in Garrison's office. And I said, who got the tapes? And he said, well, the White House, the FBI, Walter Sheridan. He said, but we doctored the tapes we gave to Sheridan, so maybe that's why Sheridan had the take on Garrison that he did. And the other name he gave me, which I'd never heard before, was Allen Dulles. Now, I know that Novell was in contact with Allen Dulles because in the files there's correspondence between them. So I happen to believe that. I think that one just kind of slipped out. But that's very, very interesting if Allen Dulles is personally monitoring Garrison's investigation. Anyway, I just said that. And Sheridan also teamed up with James Phelan. And again, if you know anything about the John Kennedy case, James Phelan was the guy who went out to sink Garrison in the media. He came to Garrison. He'd written a nice article about Jim Garrison years earlier and said, oh, I want to tell the truth. I want to tell your side of the story. Garrison gave him his files. And what did James Phelan do with them? James Phelan, friend of Walter Sheridan, he takes them to Robert Mayhew in Las Vegas to get copies made. One can't help but wonder if what came back were copies or copies of forgeries. And maybe that's what happened with the Chambre memo. We just don't know. We may never know the answer to that. But again, it's like Mayhew's kind of in the background of a lot of these things. And it's interesting, the only book that even mentioned Mayhew and Phelan as having a relationship was, I can't think of that name of that horrible book about the Clay Shaw trial by a friend of Clay Shaw's.
Was it American Grotesque?
Yes, American Grotesque, right. And in that, he had spelled it M-A-H-E-W, M-A-Y-H-E-W, so no one made the connection. But as soon as I saw it, and he said Las Vegas and, Howard Hughes, I'm like, oh my God, that's Robert Mayhew. And when I posted that on the internet, about a Phelan CIA link, I got a call from James Phelan. He was very, very upset. I'd posted also about him being an FBI informant, but that wasn't the one that upset him. The one that upset him was the fact that I had connected him to Robert Mayhew, and he threatened me. He kept me on the phone for an hour and telling me how he was going to take me to court. And I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. So I was arguing with him saying, take me to court, let's get it on the record, come on, you tell me. Then I hang up and I'm like, oh my God, he's going to take me to court. Don't tell him that, too late. But then the next call I got was from, oh my God, what's his name? I'm totally blanking. His good friend who spoke at his funeral, David Lifton. And David Lifton said, you should listen to Phelan Mayhew, which I thought was rather interesting. And Lifton also kept me on the phone for a couple of hours, and after that I never really wanted to talk to David Lifton ever again, I gotta tell you. Oh my gosh, but interesting, this little nexus of things. And so like I said, so then when I'm driving up to see John Meyer, and Mayhew calls Meyer out of the blue, I couldn't help but see a connection there as well. In his own book, Robert Mayhew said the enmity between the CIA and the Kennedys actually started with Robert Kennedy's involvement with Joseph McCarthy. Because what happened, of course, Joseph McCarthy was supposedly going after communists in the State Department. Well, most of the communists in the State Department were CIA employees that they were using to, like, infiltrate. So McCarthy was, like, exposing their assets. So the CIA hated McCarthy and what he was doing and blamed the Kennedys as being supporters of that. But what they didn't understand is that the Kennedys had been longtime family friends. They lived near Joe McCarthy. They were not supportive of his stuff. And after Robert joined his staff and saw what he was doing, he got out. He's like, I don't support this. I don't believe in this. But the CIA kind of held that against the Kennedys for many years. Of course, they also hated them for what happened at the Bay of Pigs. The CIA really likes to blame Kennedy. I really believe, from having studied that the operation was set up to fail so that Kennedy would send in the Navy. They were all sitting there ready to just take over Cuba. It was like a failed provocation that would be the excuse for war. And when that didn't happen, and Kennedy said, wait a minute, no, if the Cubans aren't going to do their own native uprising, I'm not going to support that. I think that signed his death warrant. Right, and in the aftermath of that, of course, John Kennedy put Robert Kennedy in charge of the CIA, and John Kennedy even said, I'm sorry Bobby was wasted at Justice. I should have made him the head of the CIA. That's where he would have been the most use. Now, a lot of people say the Kennedys were behind the Castro assassination plots. I beg to differ. I've really looked into this, and I looked hard, because, I'm not one to be swayed by, I love the Kennedys, but if they're bad guys, man, they got to go down for it, But none of their friends would come forward and testify to this. The documentary record doesn't show that. And in fact, the CIA's own Inspector General report basically puts the lie to this. They ask and answer their own question. They say, can the CIA claim it had executive authority, as cover for this operation? And they say no. And they go on to explain that they told Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy about the Castro assassination plots that had ended. They did not tell them about the Phase 2 plots that were continuing. And every time you see one of these books that says the Kennedys knew, if you scratch the surface and you look for who's behind that, it is almost always the same guy, Sam Halpern, who is Richard Helm's, best buddy at CIA. So there's a deliberate, attempt to blame the Castro plots on the Kennedys, and it's really not supported by the evidence. And I think that's really important. And in fact, I have a great quote, if I can find it here. Did I put it in here? Oh, I didn't put it in here. Yes, I did. At one point, Robert Kennedy had gone to South America, and there a lot of people were accusing him of the Castro plots because they were known at the time. And that really hurt Robert Kennedy. And he even said to Richard Goodwin, he's like, I don't know why they accused me of that. He goes, I'm the guy who tried to save his life. And because he was furious when he found out about the plots. He's like, don't ever do that again. And definitely don't use the mob and not tell me. My God, I've been trying to prosecute them for years, and now the CIA is off hiring them. And there's another example of that, and I think this comment may be in reference to what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bill Harvey, the CIA's original James Bond, they introduced him to Kennedy, as President Kennedy, as America's James Bond, which is funny because he's kind of a pear-shaped individual, not very debonair or dashing, not exactly what anybody would expect. But he was in charge of, he was the author of the executive action plans, basically how to run an assassination from within the CIA. He had sent 10 teams into Cuba to assassinate Castro during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Robert Kennedy found out about this, he blew it. He was so angry. Is there a way we can, keep that sound out? Oh my gosh.
It's a Mayhew dinner party.
Yeah. Most likely. Most likely. Anyway, Robert Kennedy was furious at Harvey, and he called him before him, and he said, who gave you authority to do this? What are you doing? Call those teams back. And he goes, well, some of them are beyond, callback. They're already out there. And he said, I'll give you 2 minutes to explain why you did this. And Harvey tried to blame it on the Pentagon. And 2 minutes later, Harvey was still talking. Robert Kennedy walked out of the room, called the CIA, and said, fire this guy. I don't ever want to see him again. Well, they didn't fire him because the CIA doesn't take orders from the president or his brother. The CIA instead transferred him to Rome, and where he kept in touch with.
Is it true that even though he's supposed to be in Rome, he's spending a lot of time in 63 in the United States?
I actually looked, and I haven't substantiated that. I've heard that, but I haven't seen anything
Well, I would
supporting that.
imagine, like something about, calling the phone number.
It certainly wouldn't
He's
surprise
calling
me.
Brown Derby.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all, to say the least. So anyway, the enmity between the CIA and Robert Kennedy was very thick. In fact, I think it was Richard Helms who had the quote that when you're talking to Robert Kennedy and he's upset and he looks at you with those steely blue eyes, you get a definite feeling of uneasiness. And Helms didn't get uneasy from too many people. And one last thing on the CIA's involvement, there's a book, again, I'm totally blanking, Portrait of a Cold Warrior by somebody Smith. Joseph Smith, thank you. I knew you would know. And in that, he talks about how he was teaching a class to CIA trainees that day, right after the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and how his students were all saying, hey, good job, that was really great how you killed Robert Kennedy, and, but wasn't that taking a risk, giving him such a small caliber weapon, 22, it could have missed, and Joseph Smith's going, CIA didn't kill Robert Kennedy. What are you talking about? And all the students were absolutely convinced that the CIA had done it. What does that tell you about the mentality of the people who go to work for the CIA? They thought it was a good thing, So, and Joseph Smith used that as an example of how naive he was in his early days. It was in the context of saying at that time he didn't think they'd been trying to kill Castro or any of these other things, all of which he found out about later. He never, came to the point where he believed the CIA had killed Robert Kennedy or even John Kennedy, but he, I think, came to the point where he at least left it open as a possibility. So it's clear to me from my research that the CIA and the Kennedys were at each other's throats. It's clear to me that Robert Kennedy believed the CIA had killed his brother, although he left his options open and checked out the other possible leads. It's clear to me that had he been elected president, Robert Kennedy would have stopped at nothing to find out who killed his brother. And it's clear to me that that path led straight to the CIA. The CIA had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to take down Robert Kennedy, a move which preserved their power. The assassination of RFK also served to entirely destroy the left in this country. That was the end of the line. John Kennedy was gone, Malcolm X was gone, Martin Luther King was gone. When Robert Kennedy was gone, the country kind of fell into a deep malaise that I don't think the left has really ever recovered from. That was really the last mainstream progressive politician that this country has seen. And he wasn't even that progressive, compared to some, but certainly more than we've had ever since. So anyway, with knowledge, we pry open the bars that hold us prisoner. Let information be our sustenance. The truth really will set us free. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll take questions. Anybody want to talk about anything?
We have to run the mic.
Do you want to come up here?
Well, then we can run
Or
the
pass it
mic.
around? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Judge.
Who are you? I haven't seen you before.
Hi, am I on? Okay. Yeah, I'm Brent Lyons. I'm from Lombard, Illinois,
Oh,
and
cool.
I like your work and everything.
Thank you.
I just heard from Mr. Teeter yesterday that you were on CNN in the pantry.
I was on CNN in the pantry. I was not on CNN, and I was in the pantry, but
Okay.
not during, not when I was 7 years old. I'll take it.
Oh, I thought you recently went to the pantry.
I took a trip through the pantry
Okay.
with a representative from CNN, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and there's unfortunately nothing more to the story than that, but I
Oh,
did get to see the pantry, and it is a very tiny space, and the building is really decrepit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Larry Teeter also got to see the pantry recently. I assume he mentioned that.
Yes, he
Yeah,
did.
Yeah. No, I was definitely not in the pantry that night.
What was the connection between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA at the time of the JFK assassination?
Well, I think the Joint Chiefs and the CIA serve the same people in the sense that government is really all about protecting the oligarchs. I mean, that's the only reason we have a government. You know, it's protecting the people with the money in this country. The Joint Chiefs are one branch of that, so to speak, controlling the military aspect. Of course, the CIA was the intelligence aspect. But they share a common goal, which is to make sure that the world is safe for American business interests. That's really what it's about.
Any other questions? Well, I wanted to add a little something to what you said. I worked in a bookstore when I was in high school with Lynn Schoenfeld's son.
Oh, did you?
And this was before I had really gotten into the case. But I did meet Schoenfeld, and the son would brag to me that his father had worked on these pictures. So, you know, I had a conversation with him about him, and I remembered it. And of course, he was lying to me about, you know, when I got into the detail. But Schoenfeld is the one that's mentioned in the memo as having, due to a technical error, reversed frame 312 and 313 because the Warren Commission wanted to see the Zapruder film, but Hoover sent them a letter saying that it wasn't available. It was over at the CIA for training purposes.
Right, I've seen that memo. Very interesting, yes.
And so
They also talk
instead-
about making a false positive print or something like that.
Yes.
As if they had, like, or a new negative. It was like they made a
like
new negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so they had Schoenfeld do a sequence, but at the key frames, the frames are reversed, 212 and 213, so the head doesn't
Schoenfeld,
appear to have the same action. And Schoenfeld's is also the one that tries to prove the backyard photo by having an FBI agent on a roof with a gun and a pistol with a paper bag over his head.
Right.
So you can't see where the nose shadow goes and compare the two. But,
Exactly.
but also Schoenfeld was brought up during Contragate. And pictures, like he was the photo
Okay, I
expert
didn't
on
know
the
that.
documents and everything for Contragate.
Oh, see, these
So
guys, they never go away. And
No,
Ruth
they
Payne
don't.
down there informing on the Contras in Nicaragua. You know, I don't know if many of you know that, but Ruth Payne, you know, the neighbor of the Oswalds or whatever, was, you know, at peace meetings in Nicaragua, and all the people at the peace meetings thought she must be a spook because she'd always be writing things down and taking notes, and, you know, what was she doing there? These guys never go away.
And
Last time she's been seen, a couple things. She's been seen at the state Democratic political parties, organizations in Florida. And she's been seen at these places where they have people who don't believe in the IRS. So I feel she's a government reformer there
Still.
and into the
Still.
state Democratic Party of Florida.
Interesting.
Ask Brent, he's been down to Ruth Payne's house.
I've been there, yeah.
Oh, have you? Have you talked to her? What did she say?
What did she say about the Contras in Nicaragua?
I remember now,
Now I remember I was talking with you about my visit with her, but what you guys were talking about now I remember what she said. She was planning on going to Washington that year to it was like a UN type of meeting or something, and now it brought back memories now when I talked
But
to
the
her.
reason she's probably spying on the tax protesters is because she wants to keep her government pension stable.
yeah, I've had some recent contact with Ruth Payne, and when I worked at the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors, she wrote us a letter about her son, because she's a Quaker now, even though in the interviews she said I was a right-winger back then about the 63.
She actually says that? Oh.
Yeah, in a Canadian CBC interview, they asked her.
Interesting.
And I think that they said that she was working with the Friends. I think she was working with the Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
in this exchange. But, you know, and then later sort of takes on this Quaker identity. But she, you know, she was, I also work at night raising money for a number of nonprofits, and one of them helps out in Nicaragua, and so she's one of the donors.
Oh,
so I
God.
actually called Ruth Payne this year, and I called Sue Wheaton, who knows the story about
Yes,
Nicaragua, and I said, guess who I'm about to call?
Oh, how funny. How funny. What
And
did
she didn't
say?
recognize my name.
Oh, that's weird.
You know, and then I was saying like, oh, so you've been down to Nicaragua, and she was giving me the background, and I was writing down the names of the organizations that she went with and
Oh,
stuff.
interesting.
So it's kind
Wow.
of funny. But I also wanted to back up your thing about Mayhew, because I have always thought that the idea that they were planning to kill Castro was actually a cover. I don't think they were trying to kill Castro, and
If they
Regano.
wanted to, they would have.
Yes.
They really would have.
And
They
they
have
could
the
have.
capability,
If
yeah.
they can kill Kennedy, they can kill Castro.
Absolutely.
And so Regano said the same thing, that they took the mobster in for, it wasn't Giancana, it's the one in New Orleans.
Marcello.
To testify, about that. And he came out and he said, well, what did they ask you? Because it was closed testimony. He said they wanted to know if we were trying to kill Castro. And he said, well, what'd you tell them? And he said, we never tried to kill Castro. I think they were using that as the cover, if they were ever looked at, to actually establish a domestic assassination capability, which is exactly what you're describing
Right.
Mayhew doing.
Right.
And I also think that there's evidence that not only were the Kennedys not involved in the attempt to kill Castro, but that Bobby was put into Mongoose to stop it.
Exactly.
Okay,
To keep it
and
from
that's yet
becoming that.
another reason why he would have been a target
Right.
for them, because and if he had been put really in charge of the CIA and taken out, then he would have threatened the whole Galen network and cleaned it out. Because remember, Kennedy says in October, I'm going to scatter the CIA to the four winds.
Exactly.
And I'm sure Bobby was in his thoughts in terms
yeah.
of how he was going to do that. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lisa,
Yes.
where do you stand on the future of the ambassador? And the,
For a minute, I'm like, which ambassador to England? Sorry. Oh, I was one of the people who went and testified to try and keep the building standing. It was very clear to me that, first of all, let me backtrack for a second. There's an interesting relationship between the LAPD and the LAUSD, the group that actually controls the property right now. The LAPD has been using the ambassador for target practice on the inside. They've been using it for urban warfare practice. So the fact that the LAPD is, well, I was going to say, the fact that the LAPD has been covering up, the RFK assassination, and the fact that the school board has this relationship with them makes me think we will never see that building preserved.
Peter
Yeah.
said they told him we couldn't do the acoustic test because the bullets would damage the building and actually
They use it for target practice, yeah. No, it's going down. It's going to be torn up. All the plans that they had on the table, with the exception of one from the LA Conservancy, required the demolition of almost the entire building right down to the base pillars. What they're going to build is a fake ambassador. It's going to have a fake front that looks like it used to. One nice thing, there will be an RFK memorial. I'm happy for small, things. But no, there's no interest in, using that to find the truth or to run tests or, anything of that, unfortunately.
But didn't Peter say that they were worried about having, that in court they said they were worried about having bullets fired in the basement? Well, how can they do that if they have a target practice there all the time?
Yeah,
That
to
doesn't
say,
make sense.
Larry heard the same information I did. I'll have to remind him of that because he should use that against them. Yeah. Pete Demetrio is a local news radio guy, is what I'm trying to say. And he's very close to the LAPD, and he said that like, isn't that cool? And I'm like, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We can take a little final stretch and we'll come back and I'll try to tell you who actually I think is behind the 911 Commission report.
Oh, man. I started finally reading that commission report, and I don't know that much about the case. God, it falls apart just on its own. If you read nothing else, it falls apart on its own. There's one paragraph about the flight, was it the one in PA, Pennsylvania, 7923 or whatever it was?
Yeah, 93.
And they have this weird paragraph where they say, NORAD claims they would have shot the plane down, but we don't believe that. I'm like, why do you need to believe what they would have done? It's almost like they said they claimed they did shoot it down, and they're saying.
It's so bad though that NORAD came to the first hearing not under oath and gave one timeline
Right.
and thanked the commission for helping them to prepare their testimony. And then NORAD went to the second hearing at the end, under oath, gave a totally separate timeline, and thanked the commission in public for helping straighten out their timeline.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
But it's worse than the Warren report because it has over 100 pages of these tiny footnotes at the back,
Which are actually
interviews,
really good.
and interviews and everything, but not a single one of those original documents is available. At least there were like 2,600 pages. Not everything, but you can take that and compare
They
it.
learned from their mistake of
Right.
releasing that.
So that's locked up till like 2009, but it's January 2nd, and I was trying to figure out where did they come up with this date. It's the last days of the Bush administration. You can reverse it on the way out.
Wow.
So yeah,
Scary. It's bad. It's really bad.
but You'll like what I have to say about these guys,
Yeah, I'm
because
sure.
they're also jumping into our cases,
Oh, yeah,
you know.
yeah.
We hope. Okay, so welcome back.